Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. This is Villanova Tip Time. I'm your host, Chris Notaro, and today is Wednesday, February 10th, 2021, and we are here because Villanova is taking on the Marquette Golden Eagles in the home leg of the season series. Roll the title. Just kidding. I don't have any fancy graphics or titling. But we're excited to be back for the second round of our season series with Marquette. Of course, we saw them on December 23rd. That was the Villanova's last game before the long COVID pause, where we were actually pretty neck and neck in the first half, but absolutely blew the doors off in the second half of that game. And we're feeling good with where we saw the Cats last before we then didn't get to see them for about a month after that. Before we get into tonight's game and what you're going to see from the Cats and the Golden Eagles, as always, we're going to go around the horn at the top of college basketball. We're going to talk a little bit about the Big East at large. We'll talk about what we saw from Nova Georgetown on Saturday. We'll talk about Marquette, where we last left them, what's happened since, and then we'll get into tonight's contest and what you can expect as this game comes up at the top of the hour on Fox Sports 1, or near so. They keep doing this thing where they push back tip-off, so it's super hard for me to time it. It's funny, in the year where I decided to launch the Villanova pregame show, we've had so many late games where the start time has been dependent on the end of the game prior, and so for those of you loyal enough to have watched regularly, you know that I've tried to time that end of the show with the tip-off perfectly, but it's an inexact science this year, apparently. All right, so the big news today in college basketball was the March Madness schedule was released, and we saw some interesting things that we've never seen before. So you're going to see those games dubbed the first four. Nobody wants to use the term play-in game, even though they're kind of play-in games. Those games are all going to take place on Thursday of March Madness week. Normally they take place Tuesday, Wednesday. Those games are going to take place on Thursday. And then you're going to have the first round of the tournament taking place on a Friday, Saturday, second round taking place on a Sunday, Monday, which is one day offset from what we're used to. So a little bit of madness there to March Madness. That's going to be March 19th to 22nd weekend. Again, first round Friday, Saturday, second round Sunday, Monday. And then if that isn't crazy enough, for those of you who may be averse to change, bump out a week to the next weekend. You have your Sweet 16 taking place on Saturday, Sunday, and your Elite 8 on Monday, Tuesday. So that's getting a little crazy. And then finally, the week following, you have your Final Four on Saturday, Championship Monday as normal. So offsetting the days the games are going to be played on, for those of you that may be welcome news with how that may impact your work schedule or otherwise, but just an interesting scheduling change-up that the NCAA announced today. So what's been going around the top of college basketball? We have a new top 10 this week. As we know, Villanova lost last week to St. John's, bumping down to 4th in the coaches poll, 5th in the AP poll. For the purposes of keeping it easy, we'll go with the AP poll here today. So you have Gonzaga, Baylor, Michigan, Ohio State, Villanova, Illinois, Texas Tech, Houston, UVA, and Missouri. And you saw Texas Tech lose last night, so they're probably going to drop out of there. So takeaways, Gonzaga and Baylor still at the top. Villanova dropping down to 5, which I think is very respectable. That St. John's team had been surging pretty hard and looking pretty good. So I don't know that I would necessarily call that a bad loss by any means. I guess at the end of the season, we'll know a little bit more based on how that St. John's team finishes out. But going around sort of all around, not just Big East, on Sunday we saw Iowa, number 8, lost their second game of the week, this time at Indiana. So another, call it a quality loss, if you will, still took a tumble in the rankings. And then also on Sunday, you saw the mid-major darling of the year, Drake, then undefeated and finally ranked at 25, suffered a pretty ugly conference loss on Sunday that was never really close. So again, coming out of the mid-major ranks, they do have to fight all the more harder to get noticed and get that recognition, and then to suffer a loss like that after finally fighting their way into the top 25, not great. Monday, Gonzaga held serve in what was likely going to be their hardest remaining game, playing at BYU. They won that game, I believe, by 11. The spread was 12.5, so they didn't quite cover, but I digress. So Gonzaga continues to roll in what I've dubbed the powder puff version of their schedule. Again, hand up. I've been the first to chastise them in other years where their non-conference schedule was maybe just okay or slightly above average. This year, their non-conference schedule in the beginning of the year was stacked. They absolutely deserve that number one ranking, but I contest that the amount of time they will have gone without playing a real quality matchup and staying within, a very call it a mid-major division this year may come back to bite them when they're not as sort of battle tested come tourney time as some of the teams like Baylor at number 2, also undefeated in a monster Big 12 conference, might end up being. We also saw Kansas, now unranked, beat 23 Oklahoma State on Monday. And then yesterday we had a couple of good games with West Virginia completing 14th ranked West Virginia completing the season sweep over number 7 Texas Tech. All-time meltdown there by Texas Tech coach Chris Beard, who also is sort of a friend of the program, often praises Coach Wright and attributes the sort of the type of program he was trying to build at Texas Tech to be sort of in the style or the image of the program that Jay Wright has built at Villanova. So we think fondly of Chris Beard, fresh off of a Final Four run 2 years ago. And then finally, last night, you saw both number 11 Alabama and number 13 Texas both narrowly avoid what would have been bad losses, and they just squeaked out with the wins. In the Big East, we haven't really seen a ton of action since Georgetown Villanova on Sunday, on Super Bowl Sunday, just before the Super Bowl there. And of course, Villanova ended up walking away with the victory there, which we'll get into in a second. But Georgetown actually had to turn right around and play on Tuesday at home against Creighton. Mind you, Georgetown had beaten Creighton last week and what could only be considered sort of a bad loss on Creighton's schedule. And Creighton was able to easily avenge last week's loss yesterday to Georgetown. Probably the more remarkable game that many around the country were paying attention to would have been St. John's at Butler, especially after St. John's was able to notch that Villanova win last week. I think they were starting to get high on people's list. They finally were getting ranking, top 25 ranking votes, creeping their way into, well into the bubble conversation and creeping their way as being, sort of in potentially with that win. But of course, they then turned around and lost the trap game last night at Butler. Funny, I was texting with a friend, Joe from Boston, good friend of the program here. I was texting him yesterday morning saying, this St. John's +1 line at Butler just seems like it's a sucker bet, right? Like this is the ultimate trap bet. And we both were, it's pretty easily to validate that we both felt that way. Although I definitely didn't have the fortitude to actually bet on Butler, which would have made it a real win. It was just funny that we were able to spot the trap game a mile away, but still St. John's wasn't able to avoid it. So let's see how they're going to be able to bounce back if they can get back into that bubble conversation, because right now Big East participation in the big dance is looking about as thin as it has in recent years. So you have to be rooting for some of these teams in the middle of the pack in the Big East to hopefully make a late charge and get at least 5 Big East teams into the NCAA tournament. So looking at the clock, we've got about 12 minutes left until tip-off. I'm expecting they're probably going to push it back a couple minutes after the hour, but we're probably going to wrap up here right around the top of the hour. So let's dive into what we saw in Nova Georgetown. I think if we were to go back and label all the Villanova games like Friends episodes, this one would be called the Jermaine Samuels episode, probably. The guy just looked awesome. He was he had just a stud of a game, including going perfect from deep. So that was pretty to watch. His final stat line was 32 points, 6 boards, 5 assists, and 3 steals. And it was one of those games where they probably would have blown the doors off of Georgetown if any one of the other starters had more than, an average-ish performance, which is exactly how I would classify the game. On the offensive side of the ball, it was an average-ish performance for the rest of the starters, not named Jermaine Samuels. Funny enough, if you look at the box score, they did shoot just shy of 50%. It was like 49 and change overall from field goal percentage. But they also made 13 out of 26 threes. So they made 13 threes and they shot 50%. Still, I'm classifying this as an average-ish performance because other than Jermaine Samuels, it seemed like nobody really was, taking that step forward, really stepping up to the plate. And maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they were relying on Jermaine. But I will say that, even though this game ended up being Nova by 10, it was pretty much back and forth and down to the wire there to the very end. It was a close game throughout. Even though it was pretty clear throughout most of the game that Nova was the better team. They also were just letting Georgetown hang around. And again, nobody besides Jermaine Samuels was really having a nice day. You do have to give kudos to Jeremiah Robinson-Earl and Justin Moore, who both looked pretty rough in the first half. So even just the fact that we're talking about them as having in the end what I would call an average-ish night shows that they were able to make those adjustments at halftime and have stronger second halves, which they both were able to do. And then in the end, you saw Nova play, that last 90 seconds to 2 minutes of the game like you'd hope to see a team of their caliber play when it's close down the stretch. I think if you were to sort of categorize other than, like I said, offense wasn't really the problem in this one. It wasn't a great night, but it wasn't necessarily a bad night either. The reason that this game was close throughout can probably be more attributed to poor defense and turnovers. And let's talk about those two things separately, because turnovers, they had 12 in the game. You don't necessarily worry about as much with this team. Even though back-to-back games, they're up turnover-wise, you don't love to see that. It's also like one of those, you trust this team. You trust this team with senior leadership, this team that is statistically better at handling the ball and taking care of the ball than most teams in the country. Sure, they had a couple of down games, and they'll probably have one or two more along the way. But in the end, you really trust this team to take care of the ball, and you have to hope that maybe that was just that sort of like early February lull of being a little bit more careless than you should. So you're not really too worried about the turnovers yet. The defense, though, did look pretty bad at times. And that's been a weak spot. Even I would say even in the games where Nova's looked defensively its strongest, given the style of play and the switch defense, it does often leave a lot of open looks for opponents. And this was a bad recipe on Sunday, Georgetown, where Georgetown shot 60% on 2-point baskets and seemingly at will whenever they got into the paint. Qudus Wahab absolutely feasted when he got the ball. And that wasn't necessarily the difference in the game on its own. Like they could have, I would say Villanova could have won this game easily and by a lot, even with Qudus Wahab feasting. But from an overall defensive standpoint, you want to see them tighten this up, especially when they're playing teams that are a little bit bigger than they are. And you're going to get to see that tonight with Marquette as well. So overall, another game where, in the middle of the game, you're like, this would be a terrible loss to take. You hope the boys can pull it out. They were able to pull it out. There's a lot they can learn from on tape. And then Jermaine Samuels had his best game as a Villanova Wildcat. So in the end, it's a success. And we're now on to a midweek fiesta with the Marquette Golden Eagles coming up tonight at 9 p.m. on Fox Sports 1. So let's now turn our attention to Marquette since we last saw them. But actually, before we get into Marquette since we last saw them, let's talk about when we last saw them. December 23rd feels like it was possibly a year ago at this point. It was actually about 6 weeks ago. So that was actually Nova's last game before the double COVID pause that the program ended up going on. And it's one that left us with a good feeling. Nova was up 36-30 at half in that game. And looking back on my notes from the game, it definitely felt like they had left something on the table and sort of like, yeah, they're up, which is good, but it feels like they should be up bigger. Let's hope that doesn't come back to hurt them. And it didn't, because Nova absolutely dominated the second half, led by Colin Gillespie, who had 22 points in the game overall and just seemed to be sort of Mr. Big Shot anytime Marquette threatened to run, especially in the first half. I remember he had a couple like good chest puff moments where he stopped a run with a big three. I think did it again early in the second half and was just that sort of that main senior leader presence. But everybody was getting involved in this game. There were a couple of really highlight plays. I think we had one of the best Jeremiah Robinson-Earl highlight dunks of the year from the second half of this game. And you saw what I would call strong average or slightly above average games from Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, Justin Moore, Caleb Daniels, and Colin Gillespie obviously had a really strong game with 22 points. highly above average there. And then Brandon Slater had his best game of the season with 10 points and 3 boards on his own in a game that the Cats ultimately ran away with in the second half. One thing to note, too, is, with Marquette's Theo John, who's one of those guys that feels like he's been at Marquette for like a decade, you were worried about the length, right? Again, how battle-tested is Nova against team with good bigger guys where they play more physical? But it's worth noting that Jeremiah Robinson-Earl and Brandon Slater did a really good job of keeping Marquette's bigger boys in check all night back in December 23rd. So we'll see as you look at that as maybe a game plan for Marquette to go with to play a little bit bigger tonight. You're looking to see whether or not the Cats can keep that in check. So what have we seen from Marquette since then? Well, after the Nova game on 12/23 where they lost, they won actually 3 out of their next 4 after that. But since then, it's been rough. After going on that streak, they've actually lost 4 of their last 5, including to DePaul a few games ago. So Marquette is, thoroughly in the throes of what would probably be classified now as a rebuilding year. They don't have really many hopes for a postseason berth at this point. They would have to more or less win out. Maybe I don't even know. Are we doing the NIT this year? Is that a thing with COVID? I don't know. But in any case, they'd be at risk of not even making it there. But that said, they also have 2 top 10 wins on the calendar on their schedule so far. And their last game was a home loss this past Saturday to number 15 Creighton, who only by 3 points, who they had actually beaten earlier in the year. So, it would be a mistake to think that Marquette can't win this game tonight, especially as Villanova hasn't necessarily looked their best over the last 2 games. But it's also fair to say that Marquette is in the midst of a down year. Just to look at the stat sheet and look at some of the players you want to watch out for. Last time we saw them, it really only senior Jamal Cain was the only person that really had a nice day on the stat sheet with 15 points. And as the season has gone on, 2 other players that scored, I believe one of them scored 9, one of them scored 10 when they played us last. So nothing like major noise. But the players that most people are watching from Marquette are going to be their freshmen, Dawson Garcia and DJ Carton, who are both in line for that Big East all-freshman team. And if you throw in senior Kobe McEwen, you've actually got 4 guys on this team who are averaging double figures. So they are, I would say, somewhat of a complete team or maybe a well-rounded starting lineup, but they've got 4 guys in double figures, but they don't necessarily play good defense. They play below average defense. They turn the ball over a lot. And they also don't necessarily have that guy that's like running up the score, running up the stat sheet's going to go for a huge game, right? They're definitely missing that Marcus Howard-like presence that the program has had, for 4 years, as they had a Marcus Howard as a 4-year high-scoring player. All right, so we're getting down to the wire here. We're getting right up to tip time. And to get into tonight's game, like I said earlier, between Theo John, I mentioned Theo John being the guy that's been there for 10 years. So between Theo John, between Jamal Cain, and now Dawson Garcia, who plays as sort of a stretch big man, Marquette's strength might be in playing bigger, and especially coming off of a game where Nova clearly struggled with, Georgetown on the interior on defense. Like that's something you should watch out for tonight, and whether or not, Marquette can get that kind of a rhythm going. But overall, like I said, Marquette plays very average, I would say below average defense, and they turn the ball over a decent amount, which is kind of a matchup nightmare against the likes of Villanova, whose general style of play capitalizes on those things above all else. So I don't, I hate it because I don't want to jinx it. And I even said this at the beginning of the St. John's game last Wednesday. I had good vibes. I thought Nova was just gonna run in that one, especially they got up like 10 early. But I don't want to jinx them, but I feel like Nova's due for a big game, and against a team like Marquette, who plays poor defense, especially perimeter defense, and they turn the ball over. Like you'd like to think that if Nova's due for a big game, the stars align perfectly for tonight to be that opponent that allows them to do that and really opens the door. I will add the caveat that I might just be saying that because it's been a long day. It's only Wednesday. It's late. And I'd like to speak for all of us when I say that I would really like for this not to be a stressful game tonight, although it very well could be. The other thing I would point out, if you're keeping an eye on the box scores of the last few games, every starter on Villanova's team is due for a big game, except for Jermaine Samuels, obviously coming off of an absolute monster performance on Sunday. But every other starter, nobody's played particularly poorly of late, not calling anybody out. This team, other than the blip on the radar with St. John's, this is a very good Villanova team that I'm excited to continue watch play basketball, as I'm sure many of you are. But everybody except for Samuels is due. So can we see somebody else step up, or one or two more of those guys step up tonight and have a big game? You're going to see the Cats run away with this one easy. But that's it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to say that it is indeed tip time. So get your TVs on to Fox Sports 1. We're going to wrap up here, and we will see you on Saturday ahead of Nova's big game at Creighton on Saturday. Games at 5 p.m. Eastern, so you'll see us 20 minutes ahead of time. And enjoy the game tonight. Go Cats.